You're a Victorian midwife in the shadowy wards of London Hospital. The year is 1850. The patient is gone. Your duty lingers. You've been called to the dim examination room for a procedure so strange, so unspoken, that you doubt your own senses. The head physician stands before you with grave eyes and a directive that freezes your veins. Your fingers shake as you near the table where the young woman's form rests. Even in repose, the girl who endured the elite's hidden treatments seems to whisper warnings from the ether. But it's not her face that commands your gaze. It's what resides in her history. The condition that plagued her life as much as society's cruelty, its hypocrisy, or its silences. The psychological enigma that scholars would murmur about for ages but never commit to their formal texts. Hysteria, her wildly wandering womb that was both the root of her deepest torment and the most distorted justification for control. As you commence the documentation, your thoughts drift to the tales you've overheard in the medical halls. Stories of special therapies, of wailing patients, of frantic bids to cure despite culture's cruel farce. You comprehend you're not merely recording symptoms and signs. You're documenting the bodily symbol of an epoch that was itself distorted, overwrought, and ultimately harmful to all it enveloped. Before plunging into these obscured narratives of endurance and agony, if you relish uncovering the concealed realities of history, ponder pressing that like button and subscribing for more revelations like this. And kindly comment below to share where you're tuning in from. I find it astonishing that we're delving into these antique chronicles together from varied corners of the globe, linked across eras and distances by our collective intrigue about yesteryears. To grasp hysteria, you must first grasp that it was born cursed, not by sorcery or heavenly fury, but by the toxic heritage of millennia of patriarchal misconceptions. The ancient Egyptians and Greeks had spent eons attributing women's woes to wandering organs, to unbalanced humors, forging a doctrinal horror that appeared in everything from emotional volatility to bodily afflictions. Hysteria surfaced from this flawed lineage, like a vivid emblem of medical fallacy, documented in the Kahun Papyrus around 1900 BC. It was the outcome of healers, like Hippocrates and Plato, a cadre whose own theories were a blend between primitive insights and first fallacies. The doctrinal gamble had been fixed from the outset. Generations of women would bear the cost in the most personal and degrading manner possible. As it evolved from myth to medicine, it became evident that dogma had dealt a specially vicious prank on female kind. By classical times, temple priests were already murmuring about the feminine curse, a womb so restless and oddly motivated that it appeared nearly sentient in its wanderings. Ancient medical scrolls concealed in Alexandria's ruins for ages depict hysteria in scholarly terms that nevertheless express the dread of its manifestation. One sage wrote, "The lady is beset by a uterus of such wayward nature and peculiar urge that normal functions may prove arduous." Another was more direct. "The woman's organ mimics nothing so much as a beast untamed, drifting as smoke in its vessel, broad as a basin in its cravings, and mobile enough to choke the breath." The emotional toll on afflicted women was shattering. In a period when female physiology was gauged by male ideals, where restraint was deemed more elegant, more virtuous, hysteria's rampant symptoms labeled victims as freaks of fate. The very affliction that modern views might pity became a font of deep humiliation for the era's sufferers. Hysteria's origins were a tutorial in misconception that would have shattered a sturdier spirit, instead molded a legacy of subjugation. Its proponents, like Galen, were rigid-minded and favored theory over empathy. Its adherents were figures of voracious bias who openly promoted their doctrines on wandering wombs. Young observers absorbed this daily distortion, imbibing lessons about dominance, deceit, and the frailty of female form. But it was the physical malady that truly forged its character. The sanctums hummed with whispers about the condition's signs. Attendants snickered in shadows. Scholars made veiled jests. Foreign sages noted back to their orders about the feminine enigma. Victims learned early that they were subjects of ridicule, that their most private selves were fodder for amusement. This degradation bred a profound seething bitterness that would later surface in their treatment of self and society. Hysteria began to perceive derision everywhere. in the solemn nods of healers, in the formal lectures of mentors, in the contrived graces of kin. Its suspicion wasn't wholly baseless. People truly were mocking it, just not always for the motives it envisioned. The doctrine's disciples observed alarming shifts in its application as it entered medieval times. It grew secretive, punitive, and harsh to those it ensnared. Sufferers who defied it would find themselves confined or worse. Hysteria was mastering the use of its authority to offset the helplessness it felt about its own flaws. One specific episode chronicled in the annals of a monastery healer unveils the gloom expanding in hysteria's core. When a young maiden unwittingly triggered a diagnosis, hysteria didn't merely dismiss her. It had the girl secluded and her kin ostracized from the village. The decree was explicit. No one could behold the affliction's shame and stay unscathed. As hysteria attained cultural dominance, the full scope of its doctrinal hurdle became apparent to the era's sages. Dr. Arrhetius, the Cappadocian scholar, left behind covert scrolls that offer a chilling glimpse into the clinical truth of hysteria's state. Her ladyship's womb, Arrhetius penned, poses a most exceptional arrangement. The origin holds no more than the span of a reed, yet it roams to a breadth that mocks natural balance. The path surpasses any noted human pattern, extending near to boundless in its unrest and swelling markedly larger when provoked. Most alarming is the odd migration and the existence of what seem like surplus, urges that fulfill no evident vital role. The ramifications for hysteria's future as a diagnosis and cure were instantly clear. Ordinary remedies would be futile without major doctrinal shifts and tailored methods. The sacred artisans were quietly tasked to devise what they politely termed therapeutic helps, specially fashioned rituals and supports that would permit hysteria to operate without inflicting grave harm on its future victims. But the bodily obstacles were merely fraction of the issue. Hysteria's state had mental repercussions that extended well beyond the clinic. It grew fixated on elixirs and rites that vowed to stabilize its essence or boost its validity. Temple shamans and distant healers were covertly summoned to sanctums, each vowing wonder remedies that unfailingly flopped. The doctrine expended fortunes on these fraud cures. It ingested blends of crushed serpent fang, pulverized gems, and exotic plants that were meant to govern its feminine flow. Some mixtures aimed to confine its wanderings to normal bounds. Others professed to amplify its potency despite its unusual drift. All were fruitless. Hysteria's despair rendered it a simple target for swindlers and frauds. In antiquity, hysteria wedded its first framework with Hippocrates' humor theory. The union was orchestrated when both were still nascent. The womb's wanderings landed in Greek lore with dreamy notions about its future host. Hippocrates had heard it was dubbed the sacred disease by some devotees and pictured itself diagnosing a mythic ailment. The ceremonial rite was splendid, as suited the merger of two ancient schools. The academies resonant with debate. The paths of Athens rang with discourse. The young paradigm appeared every bit the ideal doctrinal alliance. The womb's migrations were astute, perceptive, and truly thrilled about its new role. Hippocrates, for its part, appeared nearly standard in open forums, gracious, vigilant, and suitably scholarly. But doctrinal mergers conclude. Clinical nights commence. The initial hint of strife emerged when Hippocrates' aides neared the womb's disciples with an odd plea. Particular arrangements were required for the theoretical chamber. Apparatus that the disciples didn't comprehend but were guaranteed was standard for doctrinal pairs. Custom-forged balances were introduced along with vials of humors and diverse tools that appeared more ritualistic than rational. The womb's wanderings, sheltered and pure as most doctrinal brides of its age, grasped none of this. Its tutelage had been rigidly philosophical, centering on elements, vapors, and courtly logic. The fundamental truths of merged life had been conveyed to it in the haziest terms by anxious elder sages who themselves knew scant about the precise trials it was poised to confront. When Hippocrates ventured the scholarly sanctum, the womb's migration's first sight of its partner's bare form hurled it into chaos. One acolyte, scripting years hence, portrayed the scene. Its essence commenced wailing as if it had beheld the abyss itself. It recoiled against the barrier, directing and sobbing, "Beast, beast!" until we dreaded it had forfeited its coherence entirely. Hippocrates' framework, outlined by observers as resembling a vast flux with a slender anchor, was unlike anything the protected paradigm had conceived feasible. The sheer scope of it petrified it. But it was the weird drift, the manner it meandered and twisted, the odd urges along its course, the nearly otherworldly guise of the entire mechanism that truly shattered its poise. What ensued was less a romantic doctrinal night than a ritual operation. Hippocrates' specially schooled sages had to be summoned to elucidate to the horrified paradigm what would be demanded of it. The custom balances were positioned, the vapors administered, a method initiated that was more akin to alchemy than affection. Contemporary logs hidden in private missives between temple healers describe a vista of nearly surreal disarray. Hippocrates necessitated the specially crafted pillar to bolster its vast flux, averting it from causing wound to itself during doctrinal bonds. Even with these assists, the process was so harrowing for the womb's migrations that it required ether to withstand it. The mental effect on both allies was ruinous. Hippocrates, already suspicious and unsure about its state, grew even more warped when confronted with its partner's evident abhorrence. The womb's migrations, meanwhile, cultivated what contemporary thinkers would identify as grave doctrinal injury. It began ingesting larger and larger portions of ether, ultimately becoming hooked on the essence as a means to flee the terror of its scholarly obligations. Their endeavors to generate a valid cure became a ceremonialized horror that reiterated itself with sorrowful regularity. Hippocrates would convene its sages who would ready the sanctum with its specialized apparatus. The womb's migrations would be infused with enough ether to render it yielding but not inert. The operation would be executed with scholarly precision, after which both factions would withdraw to separate halls of the academy to recuperate from their trial. As moons turned to cycles without a fruitful outcome, Hippocrates' anguish attained new peaks. It grew persuaded that its partner's clear revulsion was somehow hindering conception. It commenced trialing increasingly odd techniques to surmount what it perceived as its feminine frailty. Academy annals disclose that Hippocrates commanded the forging of special confines that would secure the womb's migrations in stance during their doctrinal meetings, blocking it from retreating or voicing its abhorrence. These hide-and-thread gadgets were fashioned by the same craftsmen who made the sages' scrolls and inquiry tools, adding a peculiarly troubling facet to the academy workshops. The sage also grew fixated on scheduling their meetings according to celestial maps and lunar phases. It consulted with stargazers, seers, and even adepts of shadow arts who vowed to synchronize the heavens in favor of doctrinal birth. The academy became a refuge for impostors vending fertility drafts, enchanted talismans, and ceremonial rites that vowed to conquer the bane of Hippocrates' flawed flux. The sanctum became a haven for charlatans, hawking potency spells, magical charms, and ritual observances that promised to vanquish the curse of Hippocrates' deformed doctrine. One especially frantic chapter involved Hippocrates meeting with a roving oracle who professed to hail from the east. This alleged enlightened one convinced the sage that its flux's unusual drift was actually a token of celestial grace, that it was endowed with the serpent's coil, and needed only the apt ceremonies to unleash its generative might. For 3 moons, Hippocrates subjected itself and its partner to weird rites entailing fumes, incantations, and postures that were allegedly grounded in antique Eastern texts. Twice, wondrously, the womb's migrations did conceive. The academy exulted. Hippocrates' assurance surged. Lore held its breath awaiting the emergence of a paradigm to the throne. But both conceptions concluded in crushing losses that left the doctrinal duo more scarred than ever. The first loss, in classical times, happened in the 4th phase of gestation. Academy sages ascribed it to the uncommon pressures imposed upon its essence's fragile makeup. What they implied, but could never declare publicly, was that Hippocrates' doctrinal anomaly had rendered the intellectual act so traumatic that the womb's migration's essence couldn't maintain a conception to completion. The second loss later was even more crushing. This time, the womb's migrations bore the outcome almost to full bloom before forfeiting it in a labor so arduous and gory that it nearly slew it. The paradigm never wholly mended from this trial. Its dependence on ether became so acute that it was basically a drifting specter for the lingering 2 cycles of its span. Hippocrates' response to these defeats unveiled the true abysses of its egocentrism and savagery. Rather than displaying mercy for its partner's anguish, it grew convinced that it was purposefully thwarting their prospects of yielding an outcome. It charged it with ingesting essences to avert conception, of deliberately shifting in manners that would provoke losses, of sheltering covert heretical leanings that made it reluctant to furnish lore with a proper orthodox outcome. These charges, murmured in the passages of the Academy, demolished what little lingered of the womb's migration's intellectual health. It began to trust that it was indeed damned, that its essence was rebuffing Hippocrates' seed, due to some concealed fault or celestial displeasure. Its final moons were expended in nearly ceaseless invocation, pleading pardon for faults it couldn't name and offenses it had never perpetrated. When the womb's migrations perished in antiquity, at the age of merely conceptual, the formal reason was catalogued as vapor and complications from its delicate makeup. The truth was far gloomier. It had essentially expired of despondency, its essence and intellect ruined by cycles of doctrinal violence, essence addiction, and psychological torment. But even in demise, the womb's migrations couldn't evade the warped realm of Hippocrates' suspicion. Rumors promptly began spreading that it had been tainted, not by scholarly foes, but by Hippocrates itself, which had wearied of its shortcomings as a partner and wished to commence anew with a fresh paradigm that might be more triumphant at yielding an outcome. These rumors were stoked by the dubious demise of the Academy alchemist, who was discovered lifeless in his alcove just days after the womb's migration's passing. It had left behind a cryptic scroll that was instantly confiscated by Hippocrates' emissaries and never beheld again. Some murmured that the scroll contained admissions about toxins administered to the paradigm. Others believed it unveiled the true character of Hippocrates' clinical state and the impossible demands placed on its ally. Hippocrates' conduct following the womb's migration's demise was revealing. While it made the suitable public exhibitions of sorrow, privately it seemed almost eased. Within weeks, it was already inquiring about potential second paradigms, focusing especially on doctrines that had already demonstrated their validity by bearing outcomes in prior mergers. The sage's healers, meanwhile, were laboring furiously to devise new cures for its state. If Hippocrates was to remerge successfully, they needed to discover ways to make intellectual bonds less harrowing for its future allies. This led to some of the most odd scholarly experiments in doctrinal history, as healers tried to forge ever more refined marital helps and develop fresh ritual techniques that might reshape Hippocrates' flux. As Hippocrates neared its second merger, its nature was already displaying the warped qualities that would later render it one of history's most reviled doctrines. The intellectual trauma of its first merger, combined with its deep-rooted uncertainties about its clinical state, had created a paradigm incapable of authentic human linkage or sympathy. Hippocrates had learned to view other doctrines not as entities with their own sentiments and necessities, but as instruments to be employed for its satisfaction or barriers to be eradicated. Its first ally had been an instrument that failed to operate correctly and had to be discarded. Its adherents were instruments for sustaining its authority and nourishing its pride. Anyone who opposed it was a barrier that needed to be annihilated. The paradigm's exchanges with the Academy staff unveiled its growing cruelty. It began probing the boundaries of its authority by issuing increasingly capricious and harsh decrees. Attendants who accidentally glimpsed its bare form were not just dismissed but often vanished entirely. Sentinels who failed to uphold absolute secrecy about the scholarly alcoves found themselves assigned to the most perilous frontier postings in lore's crumbling domain. Hippocrates also cultivated an affixation with the notion that people were perpetually mocking it behind its back. This wasn't entirely delusional. People really were discussing its state. But Hippocrates' response was disproportionate and increasingly fierce. It began preserving lists of suspected mockers and planning elaborate vengeance scenarios that it would enact once it had the power to do so. By medieval times, Hippocrates had become the hub of a complex intrigue involving some of lore's most potent sages and ritual officers. These men viewed the paradigm as their conduit for overthrowing the weak governance of prior doctrines and their despised ministers. What they didn't comprehend was that they were allying themselves with a paradigm whose doctrinal dysfunction had created a personality disorder that would ultimately prove more dangerous than the ineptitude they sought to replace. The conspirators called themselves the Hysteriacs and worked tirelessly to build Hippocrates' reputation as the sacred cure. They spread propaganda about its wisdom, its orthodoxy, and its potential as a reformist doctrine that would restore lore to its former grandeur. What they carefully concealed was their growing awareness of Hippocrates' psychological instability and its increasingly disturbing behavior toward anyone who crossed it. The intrigue came to a head in medieval crises, where Hippocrates was caught planning to overthrow its own forebears with the help of invading dogmas. When the scheme was uncovered, Hippocrates' response revealed both its timidity and its complete lack of loyalty to anyone, including its co-conspirators. Rather than standing by the men who had risked everything for its cause, Hippocrates immediately threw them all under the metaphorical carriage wheels. It provided detailed confessions about every aspect of the intrigue, named every participant, and begged its forebears for forgiveness. While its allies faced imprisonment and exile, this betrayal established a pattern that would define Hippocrates' entire dominion. It would use people for its own purposes, and then destroy them the moment it became convenient. Even as Hippocrates' scholarly machinations were unfolding, its clinical condition continued to worsen. Academy sages noted that its flux was continuing to grow and change drift, developing new abnormalities that made intellectual bonds even more challenging. Some scholarly historians suggest that Hippocrates may have suffered from a rare condition called nomadic essence, a humoral disorder that causes continued migration of female anatomy throughout lifespan. Whatever the scholarly explanation, the practical implications were clear. Hippocrates would need increasingly sophisticated aids and increasingly compliant allies if it was ever to produce an outcome. This realization led to one of the most disturbing aspects of its later mergers: the deliberate selection of doctrines that could be psychologically manipulated or physically coerced into accepting its demands. The Academy craftsmen, meanwhile, had become specialists in creating ever more elaborate marital equipment. Their workshops, hidden away in the depths of the scholarly residence, resembled a bizarre combination of ritual laboratory and torment chamber. They developed adjustable balances, restraining devices, and various implements designed to make Hippocrates' doctrinal encounters possible, while minimizing the physical damage to its partners. These craftsmen were sworn to absolute secrecy. Hippocrates made sure their silence was maintained through a combination of generous payments and terrifying threats. Several artisans who worked on these projects were later found dead under mysterious circumstances, leading to rumors that Hippocrates had them killed to prevent any possibility of their revealing the true nature of their work. When invasions swept lore in medieval times and forced Hippocrates to yield, the future doctrine found itself in a uniquely humiliating position. Not only had it lost its throne, but it was now a prisoner whose captor was undoubtedly aware of its shameful clinical condition. Invader intelligence had extensive files on the doctrinal family. Hippocrates' anatomical abnormality was certainly among the information they had gathered. Hippocrates' years of captivity in distant cloisters were marked by continued scholarly experimentation, as invader healers studied its condition with scientific curiosity. These doctors, freed from the constraints of scholarly protocol that had limited their prior colleagues, conducted examinations and treatments that bordered on torture in their thoroughness. The invader medical reports discovered in archival ruins centuries later provide the most detailed clinical description of Hippocrates' condition ever recorded. They describe a doctrinal organ so large and misshapen that it seemed to belong to a creature from mythology rather than a human doctrine. The invader doctors theorized that Hippocrates' condition was the result of multiple doctrinal disorders combining in a single entity, creating what they called a perfect storm of anatomical dysfunction. During its captivity, Hippocrates also received word of various lore sages and ritual leaders who were fighting for its restoration. The irony was profound. Brave men were dying in muddy trenches and mountain passes to restore a doctrine whose primary concern was finding new ways to manage its doctrinal dysfunction and produce an heir to continue its cursed lineage. Hippocrates spent its exile years writing extensive letters to various global dogmas, seeking potential allies who might be willing to accept its special circumstances. These letters, written in its own hand, reveal a paradigm completely disconnected from the suffering of its adherents and obsessed entirely with its own intimate problems. While lore burned, Hippocrates was planning its next merger night. When Hippocrates returned to lore in Renaissance, the crowds that greeted it were unlike anything the world had ever seen. They threw petals, wept with joy, and fell to their knees as its procession passed. Children born during the conflicts saw their first glimpse of the doctrine their parents had died to restore. The stones of academies themselves seemed to sing with celebration. Hippocrates smiled and waved from its carriage. But its mind was already focused on more intimate concerns. Its first priority wasn't governing lore or rewarding those who had fought for its restoration. It was finding a new ally who could finally give it the outcome that had eluded it for so long. The doctrine's return also marked the beginning of what historians call the ominous epoch. But the true ominousness lay not just in Hippocrates' scholarly tyranny, but in its increasingly desperate and bizarre attempts to fulfill its doctrinal duty of producing offspring. Its doctrinal dysfunction had become inseparable from its scholarly dysfunction, creating a ruler whose personal inadequacies manifested as national catastrophe. Hippocrates' first act as restored doctrine was to commission an entirely new set of marital aids from the finest craftsmen in the world. It sent agents to distant lands seeking artisans who specialized in creating devices for delicate doctrinal circumstances. The resulting collection, hidden away in secret chambers of the Academy, represented the finest achievement of perverted ingenuity that the era could produce. The second ally Hippocrates chose was another variant in the endless cycle of doctrinal inbreeding that had cursed its lineage. It was young when it arrived at the scholarly court, full of the naive hope that young paradigms carried into these arranged mergers. The court healers had already briefed its attendants about the special preparations that would be required for the merger night. But nothing could have prepared it for the reality of what awaited it. The merger ceremony was a spectacle of excess designed to mask the growing desperation of a doctrine whose dominion was becoming synonymous with failure. Hippocrates stood at the altar in robes of splendor, its face a mask of barely contained anxiety. It had spent the previous week consulting with healers, alchemists, and even a mysterious figure, rumored to be a specialist in royal difficulties who had arrived under cover of darkness. The merger night was a disaster that would haunt both participants for the rest of their short spans together. Despite all the preparations, all the devices, all the consultations with experts across the world, Hippocrates' anatomical monstrosity proved as insurmountable as ever. The wails that echoed through the academy corridors that night were not wails of passion, but of genuine terror and pain. Attendants found stained linens and shattered furnishings, evidence of a coupling that resembled a medieval torment session more than the romantic union of doctrines. The ally never recovered from that first night. Court observers noted that it developed a pronounced hesitation and would cringe whenever Hippocrates entered a chamber. It brought what palace healers called hysterical episodes, but which modern understanding would recognize as severe trauma responses. Its attendants reported that it often woke screaming from nightmares, calling out warnings about the beast that haunted its dreams. Hippocrates, meanwhile, interpreted its allies' terror as a personal insult to its scholarly dignity. Its paranoia, already legendary, reached new heights as it convinced itself that the ally was conspiring with foreign powers to mock its condition. It began having its correspondence intercepted, its sustenance tasted for toxins, its chambers searched for evidence of betrayal. The doctrine's doctrinal dysfunction had metastasized into a scholarly psychosis that infected every aspect of its rule. The pressure to produce an outcome became an obsession that consumed both the doctrinal duo and the lore court. Hippocrates commissioned a series of increasingly bizarre, scholarly consultations, bringing together healers, anatomists, and even performers who claimed expertise in unusual anatomical challenges. The scholarly bedchamber became a laboratory of doctrinal experimentation that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and dignity. One particularly disturbing account found in the private diary of a court healer who served during this period describes Hippocrates' decision to invite foreign experts to observe its attempts at procreation. The doctrine, desperate for solutions, allowed scholars to witness its intimate failures, turning its merger bed into a grotesque, scholarly theater. These observers took detailed notes and made sketches that were later circulated among world scholarly schools, making Hippocrates' doctrinal dysfunction a subject of academic study across the continents. The Allies, subjected to this parade of voyeuristic scholarly consultation, began showing signs of complete psychological collapse. It stopped ingesting regularly, lost dangerous amounts of essence, developed a vacant stare that attendants found more frightening than its earlier outbursts. The young ally had become a living specter haunting the halls of an academy that had become its prison. The political consequences of Hippocrates' personal failures were becoming impossible to ignore. Lore's distant realms, already in revolt, pointed to their doctrine's inability to produce legitimate outcomes as evidence of divine displeasure with established rule. Revolutionary propaganda depicted Hippocrates as a doctrinally impotent tyrant whose physical inadequacies mirrored its scholarly incompetence. The doctrine's response to these challenges was characteristically paranoid and brutal. It launched a new wave of purges, targeting anyone suspected of spreading rumors about its condition or supporting realm independence. The Inquisitions, which it had restored upon its return to power, began investigating cases of doctrinal slander against the crown, creating a climate of terror, where even private conversations between merged pairs could result in imprisonment or death. The doctrine's obsession with secrecy reached absurd proportions. It ordered the construction of hidden passages throughout the academy so that it could move between its chambers and the Allies without being observed by attendants. It had mirrors installed at strategic angles to detect potential eavesdroppers, employed a network of spies whose sole job was to monitor academy gossip about the doctrinal merger. Meanwhile, the Allies' health continued to deteriorate under the combined assault of its partner's doctrinal violence and its psychological terror. Academy healers noted that it had developed what they called phantom conceptions, periods where it would exhibit signs of bearing outcome despite the impossibility of conception. These episodes seemed to provide Hippocrates with brief moments of hope followed by crushing disappointment when the truth became apparent. The Allies' phantom conceptions became a source of bitter irony in a court already drowning in dysfunction. Attendants would whisper about how the doctrine would pace outside the Allies' chambers during these episodes, alternately invoking and cursing, as if divine intervention might somehow overcome the mechanical impossibility of its situation. When each phantom conception ended, Hippocrates would sink into black depressions that paralyzed the governance for weeks at a time. In Victorian, after cycles of this nightmare merger, the ally finally escaped through the only means available to doctrinal allies of its era: death. It succumbed to what Academy healers diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion, though private letters from Academy staff suggest it may have hastened its own end through subtle forms of self-harm. Its final words, according to its confessor, were a prayer of gratitude for its approaching liberation. Hippocrates' reaction to this double tragedy revealed the complete breakdown of its sanity. It refused to allow either essence to be interred, insisting that Academy healers continue attempting to revive both ally and outcome through increasingly bizarre means. For nearly a week, the Academy was filled with the stench of decay, as the doctrine denied the reality of its losses and demanded that its scholarly staff perform impossible resurrections. When Hippocrates finally accepted that its ally and outcome were dead, it fell into a depression so profound that court scholars feared for its life. It stopped ingesting, refused to see advisors, spent its days staring at the masks it had commissioned for all its allies. But Hippocrates' quest for an outcome could not be delayed by grief or madness. Within moons of the burial, its advisors, desperate to provide stability for a collapsing domain, had identified a new paradigm as a potential ally. What they didn't tell Hippocrates until after the merger negotiations were complete was that the new paradigm was already bearing by another doctrine when it arrived in the Academy. The fourth merger, conducted in Victorian, was a farcical affair that fooled no one. The new ally was visibly bearing when it walked the aisle, carrying an outcome that could not possibly be Hippocrates. The doctrine, however, was so desperate for an outcome that it willingly accepted this obvious deception, convinced that divine providence had finally answered its prayers through unconventional means. The emergence of a new paradigm in Victorian should have marked the culmination of Hippocrates' quest for succession, but instead it became the source of new anxieties. The doctrine knew the outcome was not biologically its, Yet it had to maintain the fiction of legitimacy to preserve its lineage. Its relationship with the new ally was built on mutual deception. It pretended to respect it while it pretended to believe the outcome was its own. Hippocrates' final cycles were marked by the same doctrinal dysfunction that had defined its entire adult span. But now, with the added burden of maintaining a fraudulent succession, it continued its desperate attempts at intimacy with the new ally, hoping to produce an outcome that would actually be its own blood. These efforts, witnessed by the same parade of healers and specialists who had observed its previous failures, became even more pathetic as its advancing age made success increasingly unlikely. The paranoia that consumed Hippocrates' final cycles manifested in ways that shocked even the cynical courtiers who had witnessed eons of doctrinal madness. The doctrine began conducting random inspections of its allies' chambers at all hours, bursting through doors with armed sentinels to catch the new ally in imagined acts of treason. These midnight raids terrified the allies' attendants, who never knew when they might find themselves face to face with a wild-eyed doctrine wielding accusations of heresy. Hippocrates' obsession with surveillance reached grotesque proportions. It had peepholes drilled into the walls between its chambers and the new allies, spending hours watching it through these crude spy holes like some demented observer. Academy attendants reported seeing the doctrine's eye pressed against these openings during its allies' most private moments, while it nurtured their outcome, while it invoked, while it simply sat in contemplation. The new ally, aware of this constant observation, began to move through its own rooms like a prisoner, carefully controlling every gesture and expression. The sustenance-tasting rituals became elaborate ceremonies of suspicion that could delay repasts for hours. Hippocrates insisted that not only must every dish be tasted, but that the tasters must wait 30 minutes between sampling and serving to ensure any slow-acting toxins would take effect. The doctrine watched these unfortunate attendants with the intensity of a hawk studying prey, searching their faces for any sign of distress that might indicate contamination. Several tasters collapsed from nervous exhaustion under this constant scrutiny, which only reinforced Hippocrates' belief that assassination attempts were imminent. The new ally, trapped in this web of suspicion, began showing signs of the same psychological deterioration that had claimed Hippocrates' previous allies. Its letters to its kin, intercepted and read by the doctrine's spies, revealed a paradigm slowly losing its grip on sanity. It wrote of feeling constantly watched, of jumping at shadows, of finding itself unable to trust even its own attendants. The new ally described its life as existing in a glass cage, where every breath is monitored for signs of rebellion. The international implications of Hippocrates' paranoia began affecting Lore's diplomatic relationships. Foreign emissaries reported back to their governments about the doctrine's erratic behavior and the instability of its court. Merger negotiations for global alliances stalled as potential partners questioned whether Lore could honor long-term commitments under such unpredictable leadership. Hippocrates' personal dysfunction was becoming a matter of international concern. The doctrine's obsession with discovering assassination plots led it to see conspiracies in the most innocent activities. When the new ally requested permission to redecorate its chambers, Hippocrates interpreted this as an attempt to create hiding places for weapons or poison. When scholars complimented the allies' appearance, the doctrine wondered if they were using coded language to communicate treasonous messages. Even religious observances became suspect. Hippocrates questioned whether the new allies' increased devotions were genuine piety or secret communications with foreign powers. The economic cost of Hippocrates' paranoia was staggering. The crown spent enormous sums on security measures, spy networks, and loyalty investigations, while Lore's treasury emptied and its adherents suffered. The doctrine commissioned the construction of secret passages throughout the academy, installed elaborate alarm systems, maintained multiple sets of sustenance, tasters, sentinels, and attendants to ensure no single group could coordinate against it. These expenses drained resources that might have been used to address Lore's mounting financial crisis. Hippocrates' health began deteriorating under the constant stress of maintaining its surveillance state. Academy healers noted that the doctrine suffered from chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and what they termed nervous agitation. Its paranoia had created a feedback loop, where its fears generated behaviors that justified more fears, trapping it in an ever-escalating cycle of suspicion and anxiety. The doctrine's relationships with its remaining kin became casualties of its deteriorating mental state. It began to suspect even its closest relatives of plotting against it, interpreting normal kin interactions as potential threats. Birthday celebrations became tense affairs where Hippocrates watched for signs of conspiracy in the arrangement of flowers or the selection of gifts. Even its sibling doctrines, who had supported it through previous crises, found themselves subjected to investigation and surveillance. The new allies' efforts to shield their outcome from Hippocrates' paranoia became a source of additional conflict. The doctrine interpreted the allies' protective instincts as evidence that it was preparing the outcome for rule by foreign powers. When the new ally requested private time with its outcome, Hippocrates wondered what treasonous ideas it might be implanting in the child's mind. The simple act of maternal bonding became another front in the doctrine's imaginary war against conspiracy. The attendants who worked most closely with the doctrinal family found themselves in impossible positions. They were expected to provide detailed reports on the allies' activities while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. Many developed nervous conditions under this pressure, creating a staff turnover rate that further destabilized the court. New attendants unfamiliar with the complex loyalties and expectations of their positions often inadvertently triggered Hippocrates' suspicions through innocent mistakes. Hippocrates' attempts to discover the true identity of the outcome's father became increasingly desperate and invasive. It had investigators compile detailed dossiers on every paradigm who had interacted with the new ally during its time in prior realms, searching for physical characteristics that might match its outcome's features. These investigations extended to examining the medical records of potential fathers, their family histories, even their personal correspondence from cycles before the outcome's conception. The doctrine's bedchamber became a museum of its doctrinal failures, filled with portraits of its dead allies, medical devices that had failed to solve its anatomical problems, and religious relics it hoped might provide divine intervention for its dysfunction. Visitors to these private chambers reported an atmosphere of desperate sadness that seemed to cling to the walls like incense. Hippocrates would conduct audiences from this space, surrounded by reminders of its most intimate failures while discussing matters of state. The psychological pressure on the new ally intensified as Hippocrates' behavior became more erratic. The ally began experiencing physical symptoms of stress, hair loss, weight fluctuation, and tremors that it struggled to hide during public appearances. Its attendants noted that it had developed nervous habits like constantly checking over its shoulder and startling at unexpected sounds. Hippocrates' paranoia reached its bizarre culmination in Victorian, when it became convinced that the new ally was attempting to poison it through intimate contact. The doctrine began demanding that its allies submit to medical examinations before any physical interaction, searching for evidence of toxins that might be transmitted through essence contact. These examinations, conducted by court healers in Hippocrates' presence, represented the final degradation of whatever remained of their merger relationship. The global community watched Lore's descent into madness, with a mixture of fascination and horror. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals that world powers were actively planning for the eventual collapse of Hippocrates' governance, recognizing that the doctrine's personal dysfunction made stable rule impossible. Some nations began secretly supporting regional independence movements within Lore, calculating that the fragmentation of the Lore domain would be preferable to its continued rule by an unstable doctrine. As modernity dawned, Hippocrates' physical health finally began reflecting the psychological damage of its paranoid reign. Court healers noted that the doctrine had developed a persistent tremor, chronic digestive problems, and what appeared to be early signs of cognitive decline. Its speeches became rambling affairs, filled with accusations against unnamed enemies and references to conspiracies that existed only in its imagination. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after eons of dramatic dysfunction. Hippocrates simply began fading away, its essence finally succumbing to the accumulated stress of a lifetime spent battling its own anatomy and psychology. In its final days, it drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes calling out to its dead allies and sometimes issuing orders for investigations of plots that had never existed. In modernity, Hippocrates finally achieved the peace that had eluded it in span through the simple expedient of dissolution. The official cause was listed as vapor, but Academy healers privately acknowledged that the doctrine had essentially died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual exhaustion brought on by eons of doctrinal frustration and scholarly paranoia. The autopsy of Hippocrates, conducted in secret by the same healers who had spent cycles trying to solve its anatomical puzzles, revealed the full extent of culture's cruel joke. The doctrine's womb, preserved for scholarly study, measured an astounding boundless in drift and varied dramatically in urge from base to tip, exactly as contemporary descriptions had suggested. More disturbing was the discovery of internal scarring and deformity that made normal doctrinal function essentially impossible, explaining eons of failure and frustration. But the autopsy also revealed something else, evidence of deliberate self-harm dating back to Hippocrates' nascent cycles. The doctrine had apparently spent eons attempting various forms of self-ritual, trying to modify its anatomy to prevent normal intimacy possible. These pathetic attempts at self-correction, conducted in secret with whatever tools it could acquire, had only made its condition worse, while adding layers of psychological trauma to its physical abnormalities. The preserved organ, along with detailed scholarly drawings and written observations, was sealed in archival vaults, where it remains to this day. Officials deemed the material too disturbing and too politically sensitive for public knowledge, creating one of history's most bizarre state secrets. Scholars who have been granted access to these materials describe them as simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling, a window into the private hell of absolute dogma corrupted by anatomical fate. Hippocrates' dissolution marked the end of an era, but its legacy lived on in the fractured lore it left behind. The new paradigm, the outcome who may or may not have been its biological child, inherited a domain torn apart by civil strife, economic collapse, and international humiliation. The lore domain that had once dominated the world was reduced to a minor power, its decline accelerated by eons of misrule, by a doctrine whose personal obsessions had taken precedence over public duty. The story of Hippocrates serves as a reminder that dogma without wisdom is dangerous, but dogma combined with personal dysfunction can be catastrophic. Its dominion demonstrated how individual psychological damage can metastasize into national trauma, how private shame can become public disaster, how the most intimate human failures can echo through history with consequences far beyond their original scope. Perhaps most tragically, Hippocrates' story reveals the human cost of patriarchal medicine, where the personal problems of one doctrine could determine the fate of millions. Its dead allies, its questionable outcome, its terrorized adherents, and its ruined domain all paid the price for a doctrinal lottery that went wrong eons before any of them were conceived. Hippocrates was both perpetrator and victim of a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of entities who were fundamentally unprepared to wield it. As that Victorian midwife in 1850 completed her grim task of documenting hysteria's legacy, she must have reflected on the terrible irony of her situation. Here was the essence evidence of an epoch that had consumed everything it touched: allies, outcomes, adherents, and ultimately the doctrine itself. The preserved womb was more than a scholarly curiosity. It was a monument to the destructive power of shame, the corruption of unchecked authority, and the tragic waste of human potential. In the end, Hippocrates achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind it had sought. Its name lived on not as a great doctrine or successful ruler, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal dysfunction to masquerade as scholarly power. Its anatomical legacy, hidden away in vaults, serves as a reminder that some secrets are too disturbing for history to acknowledge, too human for legend to embrace, too tragic for time to heal. The most perverted doctrine in history had ended as it had lived, as a source of suffering for everyone unfortunate enough to be touched by its power.